Fellow travelers through space and time, we meet again in the fourth dimension known as Zoom to talk about our latest topic, which is going to be evolutionary fitness and natural selection. So here's an example of natural selection, just kind of a neat example that you might like. So evolution, as we know, is change over time. Now, the evolution that we talk about, once again, the evolution that we talk about is evolution is change over time to adapt to an environment. So the goal of life, basically, the goal of life forms is to be the best at surviving in its respected environment. So with the theory of evolution, the reason why animals, plants, whatever, look the way they do is because that appearance developed accidentally and just happened to give it a better advantage at surviving in the environment over things that look slightly different. So that's evolution. It is changed over time to find the best version possible of the organism to survive in the environment. And we call this term, we also have a term called fitness. And fitness is basically, zoom this in a bit, is basically the ability to succeed and reproduce. So more or less with fitness, the more you can reproduce, the greater the fitness. That's because when organisms reproduce, it's because they are incredibly fit, meaning that they are able to especially thrive in the environment. And also it's because they are appealing to mates. So when something can reproduce, it's highly desired and it has a great ability to survive in the environment. So that's when we use fitness. To give you an example, so I'm going to show you how they kind of think the SARS-2 virus is going to evolve. So right now you have the SARS, I'll just call this the SARS strain 1, the founding strain. And it has these proteins on it called spike proteins. And these spike proteins, what they do is they're able to infect alveolar cells, and alveolar cells are cells that make up the delicate air sacs of your lungs called the alveoli. And these alveoli, they have these alveolar cells, excuse me, they have a protein receptor on them called the ACE2 receptor. You take physiology, we talk about this quite a bit. ACE is a very important enzyme, and the receptor is called ACE2. Well, the virus's spike protein, what it does is it's able to unlock this ACE2 receptor and enter the cell. So it pretty much goes through, the spike protein is the key that lets it unlock the ACE2 receptor and then get into the cell. Now eventually, as more people have gotten the virus and overcome it, and as more people get vaccinated, antibodies are going to destroy the SARS virus. Because the way that antibodies work is that once they are made, they're actually specially designed to stick to the spike protein. And when they stick on the spike protein, they can basically clump around the virus, slow it down enough, like throwing a net over someone, and then the other immune cells come and gobble it right up. So now at this point, every time this SARS-1 virus, or the SARS strain 1, infects an organism, it's going to be eliminated quickly. So what that does is it puts pressure on it to mutate. So now that antibodies, now that they can detect and destroy the SARS strain 1 virus, the moment that it comes into the body, it's not going to be able to reproduce. It's less fit. So at this point, the virus is forced to mutate. And right now, what we are seeing with the Brazil variants, for example, the Brazil, the UK, the New York variant, is that they have mutations. So these are the variants. Is that they have mutations that make the spike protein better able to latch on to the ACE2 receptor. So now you have all this called the strain 2. And what happens is that their spike protein is even better at getting into the cell. So now what we have is we have a better spike protein. So what happens is that this virus is not going to be deadlier. It just is more infectious, meaning that it has a better chance of getting into your ACE2 receptor. And then it has a better chance of becoming infectious where it gets into your cells and reproduces in your cells and then breaks out and destroys them. So this strain 2 is more fit. It's more fit because in the presence of the ever-changing environment that's known as the human body, is the antibodies can much better bind to the SARS strain 1, not as well to the SARS strain 2. So strain 2 has a better chance of becoming infectious, where it's actually able to reproduce. Now, the reason why these mutations are positive for us, and this is generally the trend that most deadly viruses follow, eventually this spike protein is going to mutate to a point where it can no longer open up the ACE2 receptor. So what's going to happen is that it's going to be forced to target a different receptor that is not going to be as vital to us. So eventually what's going to happen, we think this is the model. What's going to happen is that eventually we are going to have vaccines and antibodies. So we're going to have vaccines and antibodies that are going to neutralize the strain 2, the better variants. Now, at a certain point, the SARS-2 virus, if it wants to survive, it's going to have to find a way and mutate, which it will, to be able to infect a different type of cell. So what we think is that over time, it's actually going to evolve slightly different proteins that will allow it to survive by finding a different type of cell to infect. So maybe it will just infect normal upper respiratory cells like the flu and common cold viruses do. Because eventually, I mean, the spike protein can only mutate so many ways and still be able to open up the ACE2 receptor. So the thought process is that it's going to change, so it won't even be able to infect cells that have the ACE2 receptor. It's going to have to infect other cells that are not as vital to our survival. Of course, there's questions of, well, what if it gets worse and deadlier? All right, if it becomes deadlier, it becomes SARS-1. SARS-1 was deadlier, but not as infectious. Because of that, people that got the virus developed very severe symptoms, were not in any position to go out and socialize, and thus the virus did not spread far. What's so deadly about SARS-2 is that I was actually reading about this. It actually has an ability to suppress someone's immune system, so they can walk around feeling fine, but still infecting people. So we think that at least the thought process is that the virus is going to become more of an upper respiratory infection over time, and less of a lower respiratory infection virus, which will be much better for us. So this also plays on something called natural selection. Now, natural selection what I also call is the environment chooses. So natural selection is, let's see what the ability of an organism to adapt and survive in an environment. Now, as I said a couple lectures ago, environments. This is based on the specific environment. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Unless you're a mouse. Mice can survive anywhere, it seems. And beetles. Now, this term adapt is kind of misleading because it implies that they have a choice. They don't. So when we talk about an adaptation, once again, an adaptation is a random mutation that creates a survival advantage. It is just random. If I had to rename this, I probably would name it something like accidental evolvement. I don't know. I guess adaptation or just luck. Luck might be a good one. The ability of an organism to luck into being best able to survive. Now, in the case of natural selection, if you want to use the SARS-2 example I gave, is now the SARS variant that is more infectious, the modified spike protein, that gives it an advantage because it can better infect, or it can better open up the ACE2 receptor. That's natural selection because now the variant 2 is better able to survive than variant 1. An adaptation, what that does is it creates a survival advantage in the environment. All right. Okay, so wait a second. I'm going to pause this for just one moment. Okay, I'm going to pause this for one moment. Okay, we're back. Now, some people ask, they say, well, when will the virus mutate enough to be a separate species? That's kind of hard to say. And that's because the classical definition of a species is that, so a species, the definition is organisms that can reproduce and create fertile offspring. Now, last time I checked, I haven't seen too many virus particles fall in love and create fertile offspring, so you cannot apply the term species to a virus, especially since a virus is still considered to be not living. I think that, and this is just my own opinion, is that viruses, they may not be classical life forms, but they are a form of life. So I don't agree that they're just random particles. They're able to infect cells, hijack our DNA transcription machinery, and find a way to reproduce. Then I think that they are a form of life, even if it doesn't fit our classical form of life. Okay, so this is a species. They must be able to mate and create fertile offspring. Some species are very diverse, like the Canis lupus classification, dogs, is that they're so diverse. You can have dogs that look drastically different, but still be able to produce fertile offspring. A exception is a mule, which is a cross between a donkey and a horse. All mules are sterile. Therefore, horses and donkeys, even though they look similar, in fact, at one time, we're pretty sure they were the same animal. They're technically not considered members of the same species because mules are not fertile. We'll talk about that soon when we get to reproductive isolation. But so what we think is that at one time, there was a common ancestor, And usually we don't know what this common ancestor is. We just say that it's a common ancestor. It's like we know that it was there, we just don't necessarily know its name. And through divergence, it diverged into a horse and a donkey. Actually, you draw a short line to show that it was not long since they diverged. So that's why I drew the fork really small. And this common ancestor became a horse and a donkey. This is an example of divergence, and we call this speciation. And what speciation is it is a gradual accumulation of mutations that creates a reproductively incompatible separate species. I know that's kind of a mouthful, separate species. But the key term is that they need to change into a way where they are reproductively incompatible. It's kind of like this, is that let's say that in high school, and I see this pretty often being a high school teacher, seeing students come back and saying, oh, hey, how's your friend group? And they're like, oh, we don't really talk anymore. Well, think of it like this, is that maybe in high school you were really close friends with someone or a group, and you all played the same sports, you hung out at each other's homes. And then you go to college and you get together after the first semester. You find that you changed a little bit, but you still have a lot of things in common. Then you get together during the summer. You notice that maybe one or two of your friends has changed quite a bit. Maybe they've gotten significant others, serious relationships. Maybe they discovered a love of music. I don't know, but you start to see that you don't really have too many of the same interests. Then after the third semester of college, you meet, and maybe you don't even have much to talk about, or maybe that you don't even really find that you enjoy their company anymore. And at that point, you basically become incompatible people. But it's not like it's not like from one day to the next, your friend decided that they were going to move to Venezuela and develop their passion as a cow herder. I don't know. It's just that these are things that happen slowly over time until you just find, hey, I'm not really that compatible with this person anymore. So that is the process of speciation. Something is going to separate a population. So usually it's going to go like this. So you have a population, and as long as members of the same species are in the same area, usually they don't really have too much of a driving force to change. There isn't much that's going to cause speciation. But what happens if an earthquake happens and a river forms between the population? So it kind of isolates the population geographically, which we'll talk about. Since they're now in two separate environments, much like how you and your friends were separated post high school, eventually they are going to evolve in different ways, and they're going to start to accumulate changes over time. I mean, I'm not talking like a week or two. I'm talking like hundreds of years. So you see that because they became isolated, they're not going to become separate species. Now, let's talk about this term called reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation. Now, without getting too graphic, what it is that changes accumulate. So changes accumulate. Changes equals mutations. in a species until they are no longer physically or behaviorally compatible. Okay, as I said, without getting too graphic, but when we say physical, it means that they are not physically able to do a reproductive act. But not just that, is that they also could have changes in DNA or the number of chromosomes. So it is a couple of things. It isn't just the action of reproduction, but it's also the genetic material in their gametes. Behaviorally is a little bit different. So these are mating rituals that are not compatible anymore, that are incompatible. So what do you mean by that? Things like, for example, appearance, song, dance, I don't know, song, dance, I don't know, other movements. So if the behaviors do not meet the expectations of the two organisms that might mate, then the result is going to be that they're not going to be compatible, and the female will refuse to engage with the male. To give you an example, it would be like, let's say that you're thinking about meeting a significant other. I don't know. And let's say that you meet someone that looks like they're straight out of the 1920s, and they're wearing the same clothes and they're doing the same behaviors, using the same language. You'd be like, this is interesting. This isn't compatible with me. These aren't behaviors that I find to be compatible for beginning a relationship. So you might say, all right, well, I'm going to bounce. Well, it's kind of like that. Is maybe if you were back in the 1920s, you'd say, hey, that's swell. This person is really rocking. I don't know how they talked in the 20s. Watch The Great Gatsby again. I don't know. But maybe if it was the 30s, like maybe if you were in 1930s and met someone from the 1920s, you'd be like, okay, it's a bit old school, but it can work. But as more time goes on, the more that your behaviors are going to be incompatible, to the point where that person's like, I don't really have much going on. I don't have much in common with this person here. So reproductive isolation is basically the inability or the incompatibility. It's basically incompatibility. Compatibility. That's basically what it is. Is they are no longer, either because of physical reasons or behavioral reasons, they're just not able to reproduce anymore. We also have a term called genetic divergence, which fits into this. So reproductive isolation occurs as a result of genetic divergence. And genetic divergence is what I was saying earlier, is the accumulations of mutations that lead to reproductive isolation. Okay, cool. So now we're going to talk about mechanisms of speciations. So basically, what drives speciation? We talked about one, geographic speciation, but what drives speciation? Because species do not, speciation does not occur usually unless there's a driving force, something that forces the species to develop mutations. Well, okay, forces doesn't tell the whole picture. It's more like where mutations would be advantageous and stick around. Um, Now, the first one is the most obvious one that I was talking about, the geographics. We call this allopatric speciation. Allopatric speciation. And what this is that geographical structures separate a population into separate environments where they cannot intermix. Separate environments. So an example that I gave you earlier was a population that lived in an area, and we'll go ahead and use color as our example here. So we see that we'll just say that this species. So this is the original species. Then something happens, so we have a disaster. I don't know, earthquake. And then the population is going to be separated into two. We now have a river running through the area. Now, maybe on this side, maybe something's going to happen, and this area is going to develop dark green vegetation. And here we have our population. Maybe something will happen, and this area will develop purple vegetation. And remember, organisms that can blend in with their environment have a better chance of survival. So over time, they are going to incur random mutations, and the ones that create an allele for coat color that makes them better able to blend in with the environment will be the ones that stick around. So now in the new environment, thanks to allopatric speciation and the fact that this separated population will not be able to mix anymore, is that they will turn into slowly separate species. And the same thing's going to happen here. So this will be the driving force of speciation, the fact that they are now physically separated. Okay, the next one is now called sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation. Now what happens here is that speciation occurs without physical separation. And usually this happens when less competitive species need to occupy a different niche. So let's say that you have I don't know, birds, and we'll just say that on Bird Island. Well, actually, you know what? Let's stick with giraffes. Let's say that you have some sort of medium-sized trees, and let's say that you have one giraffe population, but some of the giraffes are taller than others. So this one's nice and tall. Can get his little food. Then you have some that maybe aren't quite as competitive, maybe some that are a little bit shorter, not by much, but just a little bit shorter and less competitive. Now, what's going to happen is that for them, it's not going to make sense for them to go after the bigger tree and compete with the slightly bigger giraffes. So what they're going to do is that they are going to find maybe some different trees that are a little bit shorter, but more accessible. So it will go after the ones that are a bit smaller. So what's going to happen is that the taller giraffes will remain unchanged because they are finding food just fine. However, the shorter giraffes will adapt to be better able to maintain food source. I know that's on the bottom here. And that is because this smaller giraffe here, it found a source of food that it can eat without being outcompeted. So what's going to happen slowly over time is that this giraffe is going to change in a way where it is best able to maintain its food source. So maybe this giraffe will speciate and become, I don't know, maybe a zebra-ish creature. I know it's floating in the air. Just give me a break. Yeah. So what has happened here is that the less competitive members of a species, they said, okay, well, it's not in our best interest to keep on trying to compete with these slightly taller giraffes. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to find this food source where there isn't much competition, and then we'll be left alone. But they'll continue to evolve because, of course, populations also compete with each other. They'll continue to evolve so they are best able to find food from their food source. So sympatric speciation is usually driven by competition. An example is koalas. So koalas were pretty much, I mean, this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but they were so bad at competing for food that they just decided they were going to eat leaves that were poisonous called eucalyptus leaves. Slowly they evolved, and accidentally one koala one day started to make an enzyme that broke down the toxin in the eucalyptus leaves. So this koala got less sick, and of course passed on those genes to the next generation. So now koalas, even though the leaves are still poisonous, they don't get nearly as sick as they would have before. Okay, next is going to be ecological isolation, which goes hand in hand with sympatric speciation. So ecological isolation is separated into different environments and random accumulation, so random mutations, create reproductive isolation. Which goes along with allopatric speciation. Now, something else is called coevolution. And what this is that species evolve together to continue a mutually beneficial relationship. Mutually beneficial relationship. All right, if you want an example, we have bees and flowers. So bees need pollen, and flowers need pollinators. So this is a must. Now let's say that we have a bee. So we have a bee. I don't really know what bees look like because we're making them all extinct now. Colony collapse disorder. We'll talk about it later on this semester. So this is a bee. And bees can only see certain colors on the color spectrum. Let me look it up what it is. Let's see, what colors can bees see? Easy enough. So bees can only see from the yellow, or I should say from orange to the violet spectrum. So they really cannot see reds well. They cannot see reds or oranges. So let's say that there are flowers here. And let's say that we have some flowers that are green. Yes, this is a flower. Don't be too harsh on it. Red. And I'll just say purple. Now what's going to happen here is that since the bee has to see the flower in order to pollinate it, it's going to go to this one, it's going to go to this one, and it's going to ignore the red flower. The result is that the red flower is not going to be able to get pollinated, and it's going to have a harder time surviving, and it's going to be eliminated from the population. Thus, flowers must evolve. They must mutate to be within the bee's vision spectrum, or else they will not be pollinated. So this flower can mutate in a way to be bright green. This flower can mutate in a way to be blue. And the relationship can still continue, but if there's any mutation that leads to like pink, which is outside the bee's color spectrum, then it is going to be eliminated from the population. So that's an example of coevolution. Is species must evolve together in order to continue the relationship. That's cool. That's coevolution. Right, going to pause this for one moment, and then we will be back in a flash. All right, the last part of our lecture is going to be pre- and post-zygotic barriers. Now, when we say that an organism is reproductively incompatible, what does that mean? So we're going to talk now about reproductive isolating mechanisms. Okay, now the first category is what we call pre-zygotic barriers. Pre-zygotic barriers. What these are is that this is anything that prevents the mating act from taking place. So anything that prevents the mating act from taking place. This is things like physical incompatibility. It can also be behavioral incompatibility. It can also be differences in habitat. So basically, these are things that make it difficult or impossible for the organisms to mate. Now, the other is called a post-zygotic. So a post-zygotic barriers. And this answers the question of, well, if organisms could, in theory, go through a mating process, what is stopping a hybrid animal from forming? So these are called post-zygotic barriers. And these are proofreading and other chemical processes that prevent the formation of hybrid species. Because the genetics have to align perfectly. So what happens is that when fertilization occurs, there is a double checking mechanism that makes sure that there's things like the same number of chromosomes, the same number of or similar number of nucleotides. So what it does is it basically scans the DNA and makes sure that all the genes are where they're supposed to be. They're the size that they're supposed to be. So they basically say, okay, this is the DNA from gamete 1. This is the DNA from gamete 2. Let's make sure that they're the same. Let's make sure they line up. And if they do, great, okay, you can progress to the next stage of becoming a zygote. But if it doesn't align, they don't even let the process from continuing in the first place. So they'll say, you know what, these aren't compatible. We're not going to let the zygote form. This is a good thing because it would be like, let's say you bought I know this is a bad example, but let's say you bought a Super Nintendo and a Sega Genesis, and you were able to fit in the cartridge from the Super Nintendo into the Sega Genesis. You might say, okay, great, the game will turn on. But no, it won't. All you've done is you've been fooled into thinking that a Sega Genesis could play a Super Nintendo game, and you keep on buying games and trying them in your Genesis, but it doesn't work because the cartridges fit. Now, luckily, is that video game manufacturers, one way that they prevented this is by making the cartridges different shapes. Therefore, if you were fooled into thinking that a Sega Genesis could play a Super Nintendo game, you find out really quick that they're not compatible. So even if this process was allowed to continue into becoming a zygote, it wouldn't go anywhere because there's just too many differences. I know, not the best example, but hey, I tried for you guys. All right, so that is the end of this lecture. Thank you all for tuning in. And don't forget, quiz opens up on Thursday. And if you have any questions, then just feel free to reach out. Over and out.